Our next speaker is, well, Caroline Smith. She's a PhD student at the University of Winchester in the UK, where she's researching the notion of the scapegoat in the Hebrew Bible. And yep, there we go. Her paper is The Hebrew Bible Scapegoat, Complicating a Frazerian Typology.
Thanks, Stephanie, and hello, everyone. Really pleased to be here and to have a chance to present my paper. Although now methodologically outdated, the Golden Bough is credited with popularizing the term scapegoat and with making decisive its meaning as the innocent surrogate victim who is blamed and punished for the deeds of others. Typically, the victim is subjected to acts of violence and driven out of the community, taking with them the evil of which the individual or group wishes to be rid. The scapegoat of the Hebrew Bible that features in a collective rite of atonement in chapter 16 of the book of Leviticus is regularly conceptualized in just these terms. A real goat, it's symbolically laden with the Israelites' sins and is led away to the wilderness. The practice of scapegoating is commonly understood to trace its origins to this biblical rite. Yet complicating the typology that Frazer identifies in the Golden Bough, the biblical scapegoat was neither blamed, harmed, nor punished. Instead, it was a healing device, one whose meaning has become lost. My research aims to retrieve its original healing character, in part by proposing a critical corrective to its conceptualization as Frazer's surrogate victim. But this is not to argue that the Hebrew Bible definitively lacks such a victim. Regularly overlooked in discourse about the biblical scapegoat and its putative relationship with the practice that Frazer charts in the Golden Bough are events in chapter 7 of the book of Joshua, in which select people and animals pay with their lives for the problems of the whole group. In this paper, I explore Frazer's construction of the scapegoat as surrogate victim. Then I examine the biblical scapegoat of Leviticus 16 and argue that there are compelling reasons to doubt the latter as a typology of the former. I then turn to events in Joshua 7 and offer them as possible evidence for the practice whose name Frazer popularized. In the Golden Bough, Frazer employs the term scapegoat to refer to the device through which people seek to rid themselves of their own problems by transferring blame for them onto someone or something else. In the process, the scapegoat is usually treated with hostility, subjected to violence, physical and or psychological, and forcibly and harshly ejected from the community. As Frazer himself puts it, the group's evil influences are embodied in a visible form or loaded upon a material medium, which acts as a vehicle to draw them off from the people, village, or town. Frazer sees such practices as being widespread in what he terms primitive societies, his flawed thesis being that modern civilization has overcome such tendencies. In Frazer's words, the notion that we can transfer our guilt and suffering to some other being who will bear them for us is familiar to the savage mind. He continues, because it's possible to shift a load of wood, stones, or whatnot from our own back to the back of another, the savage fancies that it is equally possible to shift the burden of his pains and sorrows to another who will suffer them in his stead. And Frazer concludes, the result is an endless number of very unamiable devices for palming off upon someone else the trouble which a man shrinks from bearing himself. Frazer elaborates his argument with accounts of scapegoat rituals from around the world. These include a case of human scapegoats in Africa. 2 human beings, he says, used to be annually sacrificed to take away the sins of the land. He continues, the victims were purchased by public subscription. All the persons who during the past year had fallen into gross sins, and he gives us various examples, including incendiarism, theft, adultery and witchcraft, were expected to contribute. And then Frazer tells us how the funds were used. The money thus collected was taken into the interior of the country to purchase 2 sickly persons to be offered as a sacrifice for all these abominable crimes. Frazer goes on to tell us that a man from the neighbouring town was hired to put them to death. In this case, the scapegoats are human, but Frazer is keen to emphasise that the group's evils can equally be transferred to a non-human animal or an inanimate object. For example, he recounts a ritual from Assam in which a rope is tied to a monkey or rat and the animal is dragged around the village to drive out any evil. Afterwards, it's taken to the village outskirts and killed with a blow so fierce the animal is disemboweled. Finally, it's crucified. Frazer assesses the ritual thus. Here, the crucified ape or rat is the public scapegoat, which by its vicarious sufferings and death relieves the people from all sickness and mishap. As we can see here, in the Golden Bough, Frazer understands the scapegoat that goes to the wilderness in Leviticus 16 in the same way, as a rite through which the people are relieved of their own sins by transferring them onto their caprine victim. French social theorist René Girard agrees with Frazer in seeing the animal as a surrogate victim, but he goes further and argues that the Leviticus 16 rites are a template for scapegoating practices in the contemporary world. It is this comprehension that the modern usage of scapegoat expresses, he argues. In other words, he says it's a spontaneous interpretation of the relationship between the ancient Jewish ritual and transferences of hostility in our world today. Although Girard rightly emphasizes that we should take issue with aspects of Frazer's work, including, and I quote, Frazer's rather simplistic interpretation of scapegoat rituals, which neatly confirmed his cultural prejudices against primitive societies and his concomitant belief in the absolute superiority of modern civilization, Girard asserts that the Frazerian definition of the scapegoat is shared, implicitly at least, by all reasonably perceptive people in our contemporary world. Through his work in the Golden Bough, Frazer thus popularized the term scapegoat and solidified its meaning as the surrogate victim who suffers vicariously for the problems of others. Coupled with Girard's elaborations, the idea that the biblical scapegoat is one such victim has firmly taken hold. Let's now turn to the animal itself. It's one of a pair of goats that feature in a ritual in Leviticus 16. The ritual purges the Israelite community of the effects of their sins. In the biblical understanding, sin creates impurity, alienating the people from God and from each other, threatening God's protective presence within the community, and imperiling the community's very existence. To diffuse the threat, the biblical high priest sacrifices the first goat to God, then publicly confesses the people's sins and symbolically lays them upon the head of the second goat. This second goat is then led away to the wilderness where it's released, alive. It came to be known as the scapegoat because, unlike the first goat, it escaped with its life. Significantly, there is nothing in the biblical text to suggest that the scapegoat of Leviticus 16 is a surrogate victim, or that it's acting in a substitutionary capacity in the manner of the Golden Bough scapegoat rituals. There's no hostility towards it. The group neither blames it, harms it, nor punishes it. Its exit from the community seems to lack ideas of banishment or expulsion. In fact, its departure is rendered in rather benign terms. It's simply taken to the wilderness by a chaperone. Nor does this scapegoat die. In fact, a striking emphasis in the text is on the animal's aliveness. It's referred to repeatedly as the live goat. Without the connotations of the ascription of blame or the meting out of vicarious punishment, its purpose therefore seems to be limited to providing a means by which the sins can be conveyed away from the community to somewhere else, where they can no longer cause harm. With the people and their impurity ritually separated, the whole community is cleansed, broken relationships are restored, the people are reconciled with God and with each other, and God's ongoing presence in the community is assured. The ritual therefore has a therapeutic effect. It brings about healing and signals a new beginning. And similar perhaps, although it's outside my research area, to the idea of the Greek catharsis. God later commands that the Leviticus 16 ritual be performed annually on what became known as Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, a festival that became and still remains the most significant in the Jewish religious calendar. Perhaps the most famous image of the Leviticus 16 scapegoat after its release in the wilderness is this one from 1856 by the English pre-Raphaelite painter William Holman Hunt. As you can see, the animal is in the wilderness, it's alive, and it appears to be intact and unharmed. Now, the action of Leviticus 16 and this Holman Hunt painting don't appear to have a huge amount in common with the scapegoats of the Golden Bough. In fact, I argue that they complicate the Frazerian typology because the idea of the blamed and punished surrogate victim is absent. But the same cannot be said of this image that appeared in 2017, some 160 years after Holman Hunt's original. On Friday the 13th of October in that year, against a backdrop of increasing political tension over the United Kingdom's exit from the European Union, the Guardian newspaper in London featured a cartoon by Martin Rowson, which parodies Holman Hunt's painting. In Rowson's cartoon, the scapegoat features the caricatured head of Philip Hammond, the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, the UK government's chief financial minister. The accompanying caption reads, "With calls for his head from the far right of his party growing louder, the Chancellor also offended Europhiles by referring to the EU as the enemy." In Rowson's rendering, the cast-out figure of Philip Hammond is alienated from both the pro-Brexit and the pro-Remain lobbies within his own political party. He is the bearer of collective blame and opprobrium, a lightning rod through which the angst of both sides of the argument may be conducted to ground. In a nod to the artist whose painting inspired his cartoon, the handwritten words "After Holman Hunt" follow the artist's own signature. And there are clearly striking similarities between the two depictions, albeit one of them bears a human-like face. The observer might therefore reasonably deduce that the scapegoated outcast expelled to the political wilderness in Rowson's portrayal emulates or at least derives from the concept captured in the Holman Hunt image. And as I've already indicated, they wouldn't be alone in reaching that conclusion. But I suggest there's one significant point of departure between these two creatures. If Rowson's Philip Hammond's scapegoat is an object of hostility and the bearer of blame, a common enemy upon whom two otherwise opposing sides can project the group's collective anger, the Hebrew Bible scapegoat is a blameless and benign creature, a mere means of conveyance. The figure in the Rowson cartoon, it seems to me, is in the mould of Frazer's scapegoats. But despite common assumptions, the same cannot be said of the biblical animal. But whilst it's my contention that the biblical animal doesn't fit the typology and evidence in the Golden Bough, I'm not suggesting that the Hebrew Bible definitively lacks such a victim or indeed victims. Regularly absent in discourse about the biblical scapegoat are events that feature in chapter 7 of the book of Joshua. There we find the Israelites trying to come to terms with a major setback in their attempts to conquer the promised land. Having been buoyed up by victory in their first battle at Jericho, they immediately go on to suffer an ignominious defeat in the battle for the very next town. Much soul-searching ensues as they try to make sense of why their God has failed to ensure their victory. Someone must be to blame. Interestingly, in the first half of Joshua 7, the text oscillates between suggesting there could be multiple culprits, that the culprit may be the whole group, and that the culprit is an individual. As you can see from this excerpt from the text, an elaborate ritual process to identify who is at fault is then invoked, involving the casting of lots. Eventually, the process identifies a single figure, a man named Achan, as the culprit. He admits that in the victory at Jericho, he stole precious items of gold and silver in contravention of a ban. The Israelites thus have their answer. Achan is to blame for their defeat. His sin has cost the whole community. Communal condemnation, communal judgment, and communal punishment follow swiftly. Achan is stoned to death in an act in which the whole group participates. The text renders it thus: and all Israel pelted him with stones. But as you can see in this image from an early 20th century Bible, the action doesn't stop there. Achan's sons and daughters, his ox, his ass, and his flock are also stoned to death by the group. Achan's sin is rendered so outrageous and beyond all prospect of redemption that his family and possessions must be exterminated with him in order to safeguard the future of the rest of the group. Clearly, what we see happening here is quite different to our concept of the individual and the idea of individual justice. But as the text makes clear, rooting out and condemning to death the culprit and all that is his is to be expected, necessary even, if the Israelites are to ensure that God will remain amongst them. And so, in spite of Achan's confession, others become victims and must pay the price for his deeds, the ultimate price, in fact. This brings us back to the phenomenon that Frazer explores in the Golden Bough. Reflecting then on the events in Joshua 7 through a Frazerian lens, is Achan a typology of the Golden Bough scapegoat? Possibly. As I said, Joshua 7's early verses are famously ambiguous about where responsibility for the failure in battle lies. But what interests me most about this story is less whether Achan fits the Frazerian typology, but rather whether his offspring and livestock do. They seem to me to be unlikely participants in the looting that went on at Jericho, yet they are made guilty co-defendants in the story. Despite their likely blamelessness, children and animals become victims of the group's desire to expel a major problem from their midst. They are punished and killed, either for Achan sin, or for other group members' sin, or for the group's corporate failure to inculcate the kind of behaviours that should have prevented the sin in the first place. This surely makes them surrogate victims, and therefore credible candidates for the typology that Frazer explores in the Golden Bough. As I've argued in this paper, whilst the practice of ascribing blame to another innocent party is commonly understood to find expression in the Hebrew Bible scapegoat rite of Leviticus 16, and even to trace its very origins to this rite, the goat that goes to the wilderness doesn't conform to the Frazerian typology. In fact, it complicates it because it's not the surrogate victim. It emerges from its ritual encounter alive, unblamed, and unharmed. But the same cannot be said of some of the innocent victims that pay with their lives for deeds committed by others at Jericho. Those expecting to encounter the Frazerian scapegoat in its traditionally assigned home in the book of Leviticus may be surprised to find it's not there. But as I've suggested, evidence for the practice whose name Frazer popularized in the Golden Bough may instead permeate the pages of Joshua. Thank you for the opportunity to present my paper and for listening, and I'll be happy to take any questions.